there is a swamp. A lot of the system is rigged, and lots of your fellow Americans have been forgotten and have been left behind. Those are not alternative facts. That is not fake news. But I would respectfully submit, you don't drain a swamp with a slogan. You don't drain it by replacing one set of partisans with another. You don't replace muck with muck. To drain a swamp, you need an Army Corps of engineers, experts schooled in service and serious purpose, not do nothing, say anything, neophyte opportunists who know a lot about how to bully and bluster, but not so much about truth, justice, and fairness. Briefly, I was asked to resign, and I refused. I insisted on being fired, and so I was. And so I will tell you that I don't really understand why that was such a big deal, especially to this White House. I had thought that's what Donald Trump was good at. I had thought that that's in part how he got to be the president. I mean, after how many people remember the dramatic moment on The Apprentice every week when Donald Trump sat at the conference room table, manned up, looked the contestant directly in the eye, and said in that voice, "Would you kindly submit your letter of resignation?" I don't remember that. So, I just thought he should be comfortable doing what he knew how to do best.
His office was tapped or wiretapped, and no evidence of that has ever materialized. No, he suggested on at least one occasion that maybe he had recorded conversations, refuses to answer questions about whether or not that is true. But I think the point is that accusations made in the heat of the moment in 140 characters on Twitter based on the track record and history are not to be taken very seriously.
His whole team is doubling down on this idea that the leak that James Comey admitted to could be illegal. Corey Lewandowski told me on Friday on GMA that it's possible he could be prosecuted for this. Anything illegal in that leak to the New York Times?
Yeah, so I'm not in the business of making legal pronouncements on what's legal, what's criminal anymore, but I will say it sounds like more of a distraction. First of all, I think nothing that was in the memo or in the conversations he had with his friend at Columbia Law School was classified. Second, I don't understand what the privilege argument is. The president's team fully was aware that the memo was going to be discussed and the conversations were going to be discussed at the hearing, and had the opportunity when many reporters asked if they would invoke executive privilege to try to prevent some of that from being talked about, and they declined that opportunity. So I think the main point that people should be focusing on, from what I can see, is that you have uncontroverted evidence from someone who was under oath that on at least one occasion, the President of the United States cleared a room of his Vice President and his Attorney General and told his Director of the FBI that he should essentially drop a case against his former National Security Advisor. And whether or not that is impeachable or that's indictable, that's a very serious thing. And I'm not sure that people fully get that the standard is not just whether something is a crime or not, but whether or not it can be charged as a crime or Congress will impeach. It's a very serious thing. And there's a lot to be frightened about and a lot to be outraged about if you have a president who A, may have done it, although I know he denies it, but he hasn't done it under oath yet, and B, he seems to suggest that even if he had done it or said words to that effect, there's nothing wrong with that. And you have other people who seem to be excusing it. That's an incredibly serious thing if people think that the President of the United States can tell heads of law enforcement agencies, based on his own whim or his own personal preferences or friendships, that they should or should not pursue particular criminal cases against individuals. That's not how America works.
I want to dig into that more in a minute, but let me just stay on this leak for just a second. Even if the going through a friend of the New York Times wasn't illegal, was it a violation of FBI regulations, which would, in some cases, people say require, before that revelation, getting advance authorization from the FBI?
Yeah, I don't know. It doesn't seem to be. One could make the argument that it was not the best way to go about trying to bring a story into the open. I mean, obviously, Jim Comey was comfortable after being called to testify about the memos and about the conversations, and it was just his recollection. So, I don't really see what the major issue is. It may be that there was a better way to bring the information out, like he did in the hearing ultimately.
One of the other things the president's supporters have said is that James Comey, if he really thought something was wrong in that meeting you just referred to, that Oval Office meeting where everybody else was kicked out, he should have said no to the president right there, or he should have reported this evidence of a crime back to the FBI or the Justice Department.
Yeah, but as I understand it, he did say no. And the no that he said was that to himself and to his people, that we were not going to do what the president had asked. He wasn't going to drop the investigation. So I think, he decided in his own mind he wasn't going to follow the direction of the president. And he says he took it as a direction, and that was that. One
other thing on James Comey, he talked about that encounter with Loretta Lynch in the email investigation. She wanted to describe it as a matter. He wanted to describe it as an investigation. He said that made him queasy. Did that make you queasy too?
Well, it wasn't said to me. I think if it's true and you're listening to it as a third party, it's not the greatest instruction in the world. But if I can just say one other point on this issue of whether or not Donald Trump knew what he was doing. And I saw, I think over the weekend, that Paul Ryan, who's I think in line to be president of the United States, he's in the succession line, has been trying to excuse this behavior. Again, putting aside whether it's obstruction or impeachable. That the President of the United States is new to this, and he's new to protocols, makes very, very little sense when the President became the President in part by campaigning at rally after rally after rally that I saw and Americans saw on the issue of whether or not it was appropriate for the former Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, to have a meeting on the tarmac with Bill Clinton. So he very well knew what the optics of that were and what the protocols were. And even though there's no evidence and no one has come forward to say anything untoward was discussed on that airplane at the tarmac when an ongoing investigation was underway with respect to Hillary Clinton, he nevertheless said, this is a reason why you should vote for me and not for that person. And for people to turn around and say, now that there is evidence that the President of the United States himself had a private conversation after kicking other high officials out of the room and told his FBI director confidentially to do something about a case that's pending, I think that's a big deal, and it can't be excused as simply being a novice or new.
The president's defenders, like Alan Dershowitz, say there's no grounds for obstruction. You've talked about that. And he, in fact, says that the presidents have the constitutional right to fire FBI directors and investigations as much as they want. One of the president's attorneys, Jay Sekulow, is coming up next. He says there's no no basis for obstruction. You're a former prosecutor. Is there evidence there to begin a case for obstruction?
I think there's absolutely evidence to begin a case. I think it's very important for all sorts of armchair speculators in the law to be clear that no one knows right now whether there is a provable case of obstruction. It's also true, I think, based on what I see as a third party and out of government, that there's no basis to say there's no obstruction. And this point on whether or not the president has legal authority to fire or to direct an investigation, I don't really get it. It's a little silly to me. The fact that you have authority to remove someone from office doesn't automatically immunize that act from criminal responsibility. And I'll give you an example of something from a different context. If it were to be true, and this is all made up for the sake of argument, if it were to be true that Michael Flynn offered $1 million to Donald Trump and said, I'm going to give you this $1 million, and I'm giving it to you because I want you to fire Jim Comey. And then Donald Trump fired Jim Comey, which everyone agrees he has the absolute authorization and authority to do. That would be an open and shut federal criminal case. It's a quid pro quo, and he could be charged if he were not the President of the United States. So this argument that you keep hearing on the TV shows that the mere fact that the President can fire an official at will doesn't solve the problem.
In the end, though, as a prosecutor, what gets this beyond a he said case?
I don't know if there's other evidence. I mean, we heard people talk about tapes, and there's a lot of cute game playing about whether or not there are tapes. That could prove it. But you have this in court all the time, and you look at the surrounding circumstances and the indicia of truthfulness, and those things include contemporaneous statements to other people. They include the track record of the witness. They include whether or not one of the he's in the he said has a track record for lying or not, both on the air and in legal proceedings like depositions, and I believe there is such a track record with respect to one of the parties. So, you make your arguments as you can, and it may be the case, like I've said, that no ultimate actual legal proceeding can be brought. I think people should keep an open mind about that, and I'm the first to say it. And the only people who are going to make that decision are the team that Bob Mueller is assembling.
So are you pretty confident now that there's no question that President Trump will be investigated for obstruction by Bob Mueller?
I don't know. I'm not part of that team, but it seems reasonable that if Bob Mueller is looking at everything that you would expect him to look at. Good prosecutors look at everything, and this would seem to be one of those things that he was looking at.
How far does the scope of a special prosecutor go in a situation like this? How far beyond the questions, the underlying collusion charges with Russia, the question of obstruction? Is this something that could eventually get into the Trump Corporation businesses? Does the special counsel have that kind of leeway?
You know, I don't know where he'll go. I think that Bob Mueller, by reputation, proceeds with caution and doesn't get over his skis ever. So I think you'll have confidence that there will be a responsible investigation that goes where it needs to go and not beyond.
And we heard the president say he wanted to testify or willing to testify under oath. Any doubt that Bob Mueller would take him up on that?
No, I think the way you do any kind of investigation that involves somebody who's a high official is you gather all the other evidence. We did investigations like this of high officials in New York State all the time. And what you do is you painfully and painstakingly gather evidence from as many witnesses as possible and documents and everything else. And at the end of that, typically, then you interview the principal. You had several encounters with President-elect Trump before you were fired by President Trump back in March. Starting at during the transition, he invited you to Trump Tower, asked you to stay on as U.S. Attorney? He did. And then he followed that up with 2 phone calls as President-elect? He did. What happened in those phone calls? So they're very unusual phone calls, and it's sort of when I've been reading the stories about how the president has been contacting Jim Comey over time, it felt a little bit like deja vu. I'm not the FBI director, but I was, the chief federal law enforcement officer in Manhattan with jurisdiction over a lot of things, including, business interests and other things in New York. The number of times that President Obama called me in 7.5 years was 0. The number of times I would have been expected to be called by the President of the United States would be 0, because there has to be some kind of arm's length relationship given the jurisdiction that various people have. So what did he say? So he called me in December, ostensibly just to shoot the breeze and asked me how I was doing and wanted to make sure I was okay. It was similar to what Jim Comey testified to with respect to a call he got when he was getting on the helicopter. I didn't say anything at the time to him. It was a little bit uncomfortable, but he was not the president. He was only the president-elect. He called me again 2 days before the inauguration, again, seemingly to check in and shoot the breeze. And then he called me a third time after he became president, and I refused to return the call. That you didn't take because he was president. But on those other phone calls, James Comey talked about the president trying to develop what he called a patronage relationship. Is that what you think was happening with you? So that's not the word I used. I was in discussions with my own folks, and in reporting the phone call to the chief of staff, to the attorney general, I said it appeared to be that he was trying to cultivate some kind of relationship. And it may be hard for viewers of yours to understand if you're a layperson and not in the Justice Department. What's wrong with that? The CEO of a company wants to call, a field manager somewhere in the country because he thinks he's an up-and-comer. What's wrong with that? The problem is the Justice Department is different. And for the same reasons that Donald Trump emphasized how it looked when there was that tarmac incident and you had a private conversation between someone who had an interest in an investigation and the person who was responsible for, advancing or ending that investigation, it's a very weird and peculiar thing for a one-on-one conversation without the Attorney General, without warning, between the President and me or any United States attorney who has been asked to investigate various things and is in a position, hypothetically, to investigate business interests and associates of the President. Based in New York. Hypothetically, there is the authority to investigate all sorts of interests relating to a president, which is why there are strict guidelines in place about what can or cannot be talked about. Now, I'm not saying that he was going to ask me about a case, although there is some evidence in the record now that after a period of time, given the Jim Comey testimony, there's some evidence that Donald Trump didn't think anything of asking a high-level law enforcement official to take a particular action that he wanted for himself on a criminal case. And then when he was actually president, you refused to take the call, and I guess the next day you're fired? So the call came in, I got a message, we deliberated over it, thought it was inappropriate to return the call, and 22 hours later I was asked to resign, along with 45 other people. And some Democrats, notably Elizabeth Warren, connecting that to the fact that you did have jurisdiction over Trump Tower. Do you think there's any connection? I'm not drawing the connection. I've lived long enough to know that anything is possible, and we're seeing a lot of things going on now with respect to accusations that Jim Comey made under oath in a congressional hearing. So I don't know. To this day, I have no idea why I was fired. It doesn't bother me. I'm living a good life and very happily. But I have no idea.
Preet Bharara, thanks for coming in today.
Thank you.